lucky. Hi, I'm Raymond Camden. I work for a company called Here Technologies. We do a lot of location stuff, which is nothing at all that I'm talking about today. But if you need any help with routing and mapping or and stuff like that, definitely let me know. I am one of the co-authors of the Jamstack book that literally went into early access about a half hour ago. In fact, my slide deck had a meet coming soon, and the email came in right when this was starting up. So I did a quick edit as well. But if you go to the URL on there, or just go to Manning.com and search for the Jamstack book, you will see the book that myself and Brian Rinaldi were working on. It's 10 chapters, and 4 of them are out now. And the way that Manning does this is as we turn stuff in and it gets copy edited, the book gets updated. So it's not the final release, but if you buy it now, you get the final release when it's done. I blog at Raymond Camden, and that's mainly what I'm talking about because my blog is built on Eleventy. And I tweet at Raymond Camden, and my DMs are open. And I really like to get questions because a lot of times it turns into pretty interesting blog content. So definitely feel free to reach out to talk to me about JavaScript, Jamstack, Star Wars, and more. So I want to start off with just a quick history lesson, talking specifically about my blog because it is Jamstack, and how it got there was kind of fun. I launched my blog, and it wasn't RaymondCamden.com. I could barely afford domains back then, but I launched it way back in 2003. So it's been around a very long time. And in that time, I've written a few blog posts. Now that is a pretty impressive number, but I want to point out that when I started blogging, there was no Twitter. So like a lot of my blog content in the early days was like, hey, this person wrote this really cool article, go check it out. Or this person is giving a presentation next week. So a lot of that 6,000 blog posts is a bunch of small, short bites that I'm just trying to help people discover other things that I use Twitter for now when I'm not raving about how cool Star Wars is. I definitely am not keeping that cadence of 300 plus a year now. Even before 2020 became 2020, I had slowed down a bit. So like last year I had, I think, 65 blog entries, and this year, hopefully I'll hit about 80 or so. My goal is to try to do about 1 a week just to keep a nice cadence up there. And again, 2020 being what it is, it's a struggle. When I started back in 2003, I did what everybody did back then. I wrote my own blog engine because that's what you were supposed to do, uphill in the snow both ways. I used to be very big in a community called the Cold Fusion community. It's server-side language that was never free, never open source, so it was never as popular as like PHP and other things, but it had a very, very good, very passionate, very friendly community that I was a part of back in the old days. So most of my blog back then was talking about then, and I built my blog in Cold Fusion. I gave it away as open source and worked on it for quite some time. It had pretty good traffic, nothing crazy, but it had a decent amount of traffic, and it worked well. And so because it worked well, obviously I had to mess with it because, as a programmer, I can't leave anything running well alone. So at some point, and especially as I moved kind of away from the Cold Fusion community and started doing more different stuff, I decided that I was just going to move to WordPress. Because I was kind of tired of maintaining my own blog. I had heard really good things about WordPress. I switched to it in December of 2014. And what was awesome is that when I switched to WordPress, nothing went wrong. I mean, it was awesome. I installed it. I wrote some code to translate my blog post on a SQL Server. I launched WordPress, and it was perfect. Like my site was up and running. I never had to think about it. Oh crap. Yeah. So if you actually go to my blog post and like go back to when I released, like the first post says, hey, I'm on WordPress. Well, the first post on that translation. And then like 2 days later, yeah, I'm still working on that bug. And then a couple of days later, oh, I'm still kind of fixing things. And it was just this continuous thing. And uh, WordPress was amazingly awesome in terms of an authoring experience. Like I loved writing blog posts in WordPress. I loved the one click to add a feature. I was shocked how fragile WordPress is. And maybe that was my fault. Maybe I didn't configure it correctly, but I kind of assumed that out of the box it would work. Maybe that's crazy. And it didn't. So about that time, I had been looking at Jamstack back before it was called Jamstack. In fact, actually, I looked at a static site generator called Harp. I'm not sure if anyone here has ever used Harp. It's not really worked on much anymore, but at some point, I decided I was going to go static for my blog. And I chose Hugo. I moved to Hugo in 2016. Hugo is incredibly fast, and that worked for my large site. So going by memory, it would parse my 6,000 entries or so in about 3 seconds, which is pretty fast. And that's great. But at the same time, I hated Hugo. And I just want to be clear, I'm not bad-mouthing Hugo. When I talk about Jamstacks, when I give kind of generic non-Eleventy specific presentation, and by the way, hey, I don't have a sticker either. I'm just throwing that out there. Yeah, whenever I talk about Jamstack, I'm really sure to stress to people that there's like 400 different options for the generators that you can use. Some you will not like, some you will like. Find the one you like. So guess what? I did not like Hugo. I'll give an example a bit later about why I didn't. I know a lot of people do, but Hugo, it's not you, it's me. And we had to break up. So going forward a bit more, I eventually moved to Jekyll in 2018. And not as fast, especially Jekyll 3.x when I got it. 4.x is quite a bit faster, but when I was using it, it was a bit slow. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about in a minute or so comes from what I learned there. But I really, really liked Jekyll. It was really fun to use. I love the liquid language. Everything about Jekyll clicked with me. Everything clicked. The only issue is that, like, if I got a new piece of hardware and I had to install a Jekyll, it was like, let me get a bottle of wine. Clear out about 8 hours because Jekyll on Windows wasn't a fun experience. The last time I had to do it, it wasn't too bad. And especially on, Windows, like a modern Windows using Ubuntu under WSL, it's not as bad. But like, I looked forward to building demos in Jekyll. I never looked forward to installing Jekyll at all. So eventually I discovered Eleventy, and fairly recently, just a bit over a year ago. And I discovered it and I looked at it and like something kind of like fun happened. So like, if you go to my blog archives page for Eleventy, you go to the bottom, the first post, October 12th, is, hey, I'm kind of digging this crap. This is pretty cool stuff here. And that's October 12th. And then it just like escalated until like 3 or 4 months later, I had just converted my entire blog to Eleventy. And I think I did it over a weekend, instead of like watching TV and being a good parent. I worked on my blog too much. But yeah, I absolutely fell in love with it. So all that being said, as much as I love Eleventy and the Jamstack in general, I kind of came into it trying to handle a very, very large website. So some of the things I've learned, and this really has applied to Hugo and Jekyll as well, there are things that I suggest for both making your local development a little bit better, making those build times and production better as well. And then another tip is how to handle media. And I'll explain why that was an issue for me. And again, I think I'm probably not the normal use case with 6,000 posts or so. But anyway, so when working locally, you absolutely want to use the quiet option. Quiet is what kind of hides all that nice little output where Eleventy will say, hey, I'm taking so-and-so.md and outputting to .html. Because even if you do what I'm going to mention in a minute about making the build times quicker, you still end up with lots and lots of output. So if I have Eleventy only looking at my last 200 blog posts, for example, it's still streaming a lot in my terminal. And if I'm doing anything fancy at all, I can't even see it because it just outputs all this data. So you absolutely want to use that quiet option to make things go a bit quicker. Certainly, the next thing that you want to use is the .11 ignore. On my local machine here, this is what it looks like, where I basically ignored 95% of my blog when working locally, because most of my writing was in the earlier aspect. This works well for me, except when I get a comment on something from like 2009 and I look at the live version and I see that the formatting's a bit off and I need to unglob it and come back. And so typically I actually have a line for each year so I could quickly like bring back a year. So this is covered in the docs, pretty obvious. Some caveats though for that. Obviously don't check it into your repo because it'll go into production and it'll hide stuff. I only mention this because coming from Jekyll, I found out that there's no way to tell Eleventy to not use this file. And I have filed a issue for this because what I would do in Jekyll is in my local dev, I would run Jekyll and say, hey, be configured via this file. And in that file, I would hide most of my content locally. In production, it would use a default config file. And in Eleventy, you can't do that. So basically, I don't check it in. I have it and get ignored just to be sure I don't check it in because I'm dumb. And then if I move to a new machine, I recreate it. But I would love to see Eleventy have some way to, include this and be ignored in production. The other issue I've run into as well is working with UI stuff. And that really only comes into play when I'm like modifying how my categories look. Because if I'm hiding 95% of my content, anything that's generated from that content won't show up. And I realize I'm a little bit past 11 minutes. I'll go quicker, I promise. The other thing you want to look out for, obviously, is anything that you do on startup. I have some custom logic in my data file. So this is a data file that hits the Netlify Analytics API. This is not documented, so absolutely don't use it, but it's in my GitHub repo, so totally use it if you want to. But this gets my most popular posts. I like putting that on my blog as a way to drive interest in other stuff. And what I need to do is find a way to mock this locally, because every time I do something, this runs, hits the API and slows things down. In production, definitely look for things that impact the entire site. And for Netlify, you absolutely want to disable form processing if you're not using their form processing feature. One of the things I found really quick with working with the Jamstack is that some things will change one page. So like when I impact my speaking engagements, and some things will impact everything. So I couldn't figure out why when I wrote a blog post, it was so long to build versus when I added a speaking engagement. And that's because I had a widget on my blog post that was my last 5 blog entries. And guess what? Every time I wrote a post, all 6,000 blog posts had to be updated to change that list. What I ended up using for a long time was using Ajax. So I just generated this file. And by the way, this is why I left Hugo, because I spent a day trying to get Hugo to output JSON. And Hugo was like, no, sir, I'm going to output HTML and you can't tell me otherwise. I know that supposedly they've made that easier, but I still can't figure out how to generate JSON in Hugo. So in Hugo, I generated HTML and used the jQuery.load because it worked. And I eventually got in JSON in Eleventy. And eventually I ended up rolling it back because Eleventy is fast enough now where I don't care. But if this impacts you, look for things like this as a way to kind of not change every single page when you write content. Again, obviously, Netlify, if you're using them, they have a feature which I knew about. I did not know that Netlify had a way to turn off this feature. Go into your settings, turn off form detection if you're not using it. This, I think, cut about 20% of my build time just by hitting a button. And I loved doing that because it felt great. Media, for me, 6,000 blog posts, a lot of them had associated images with it. I counted over 1,000 images, a bunch of zip files for downloads and other stuff. What I did, I cheated. I took it out of the Jamstack. I dropped it on Amazon S3 and just basically wrote a regex on my blog files to change all the links. I also created a snippet in Visual Studio Code to make it easier to use those images. And for the most part, it was easy, except for the HTTPS part. which Amazon makes it a little bit difficult. So far it's working good. These are my build times as of yesterday when I built this slide. And you can see I average about 20 minutes. The smaller post about 5 minutes or so. And I'm definitely a couple of minutes over my 11, so I apologize. Thank you for hearing me out. Again, my DMs are open. Please ask me any questions. And thank you for hearing me out.